Science fiction has often been used to imagine distant futures, unfamiliar worlds, and technologies that feel safely removed from everyday life. But some films operate much closer to reality. Instead of projecting centuries ahead, they focus on ideas that were already forming at the moment of their release. Ideas rooted in military research, corporate systems, psychological experimentation, and emerging technologies that institutions preferred not to discuss openly. This video focuses on that specific corner of science fiction. Rather than celebrated blockbusters or widely referenced classics, these films were built around concepts that felt sensitive, inconvenient, or politically uncomfortable for their time. They were not banned, and they were not hidden by official decree. Instead, many were released quietly, marketed cautiously, or allowed to fade while safer narratives moved into the spotlight. Their futures were not rejected outright. They were simply deprioritized. The films in this list share a common pattern. Each one explores a system designed to operate with limited transparency surveillance networks, classified research programs, controlled experiments, or technologies whose consequences were easier to manage in secrecy than in public debate. In these stories, danger does not arrive suddenly. It emerges from routine procedure and decisions made behind closed doors. What makes these movies relevant today is not how extreme their ideas were, but how restrained they now appear. Many of the technologies and systems they questioned have since become normalized, reframed as infrastructure rather than threats. Their warnings were not disproven. They were absorbed. This countdown looks at 15 sci-fi action films built on ideas Hollywood seemed unwilling to fully confront at the time of release. The focus is not on special effects or spectacle, but on the concepts underneath what they implied about power control and responsibility, and why those implications may have been easier to set aside than to address directly. These are not stories about forbidden knowledge. They are stories about futures that arrived quietly after the questions stopped being asked. Let's begin. 1. Disclosure 1994. Disclosure examines technology not as hardware, but as a tool for controlling narrative reality. The film centers on corporate power structures where digital systems, virtual environments, and recorded data are used to redefine truth rather than document it. Technology becomes a mechanism for shaping perception inside institutional spaces. The story follows a workplace conflict escalated through manipulated records and simulated evidence. What matters is not what occurred, but what can be reconstructed convincingly. Digital environments allow authority to rewrite context, turning ambiguity into leverage. The film's core value lies in its early recognition of mediated reality. As workplaces began integrating digital records and virtual simulations, Disclosure anticipated how control over systems would translate into control over credibility. Evidence becomes modular. Truth becomes negotiable. Unlike traditional thrillers, the film offers no technological resolution. The systems function exactly as designed. The danger is not malfunction, but misuse within structures that reward outcome over accuracy. Often dismissed due to controversy, Disclosure nonetheless captured a shift that would later define information culture. Its question remains relevant when reality is filtered through systems owned by institutions, who ultimately decides which version is accepted as fact. 2. The Hunt for Red. October 1990. The Hunt for Red October frames technological advancement as a destabilizing force rather than a triumph. At the center of the film is a submarine equipped with a propulsion system so quiet it effectively disappears from detection. Its power does not lie in firepower, but in invisibility. The ability to move without being tracked threatens existing strategic balance. The narrative follows military and intelligence institutions attempting to interpret intent within a system built on secrecy. The central conflict is not combat, but uncertainty. Once a technology eliminates reliable observation, traditional deterrence logic begins to fail. Decision-making becomes reactive, driven by fear of misinterpretation rather than confirmed threat. The film's core value lies in its treatment of innovation as escalation. The propulsion system does not resolve conflict. It intensifies suspicion. Control becomes harder to verify. Trust becomes structurally impossible. Progress, rather than stabilizing relations, increases the risk of catastrophic misunderstanding. Released as Cold War tensions were publicly easing, the film revealed how deeply escalation logic remained embedded in military planning. Even as diplomacy advanced, systems continued to evolve in silence. Breakthroughs were absorbed into classified frameworks rather than publicly examined. Despite its popularity, the film's implications were rarely explored beyond narrative mechanics. Yet its concern remains unresolved. When power becomes undetectable, the question shifts from capability to intent, and intent is the hardest variable to measure. True, Deep Star 6, 1989. Deep Star 6 relocates science fiction away from space and into the ocean, but retains the same structural concern development conducted beyond oversight. The film is set in a deep-sea military installation, tasked with testing classified technology far from public access. Isolation is not accidental. It is a requirement. The narrative unfolds as the station encounters an unexpected threat. Yet the true tension lies in procedural confinement. Communication with the surface is limited. Decisions are constrained by protocol. Transparency is impossible by design. The film's core value lies in its depiction of secrecy as environment. The physical depth mirrors institutional depth. Failure is contained not to protect people, but to protect programs. Survival becomes secondary to operational continuity. At the time of release, underwater military research was expanding, quietly driven by strategic interest rather than exploration. Deep Star 6 reflects concern about innovation conducted where accountability cannot reach. Often dismissed as genre horror, the film's implications were overlooked. Its premise offered no heroism and no meaningful exposure of the system. Today, Deep Star 6 feels understated. As technological testing moves into increasingly inaccessible domains, the film leaves an unresolved question: when innovation is buried by design, who determines when it should surface? 4. Millennium, 1989. Millennium approaches time travel as logistics rather than wonder. The film introduces a future society facing extinction that survives by extracting people from moments just before disaster. Plane crashes become collection points. Survival is managed through quiet intervention rather than historical change. The story follows an investigator who uncovers the operation, revealing a system designed to preserve outcomes while ignoring consent. Individuals are selected based on biological criteria rather than choice. History is left intact while lives are removed without awareness. The film's core value lies in its framing of preservation as exploitation. Instead of preventing catastrophe, the future adapts by harvesting from the past. Ethics are postponed indefinitely in favor of survival metrics. The system functions smoothly because it avoids confrontation with those it affects. Released at a time when demographic modeling and long-term planning were gaining influence, Millennium reflected anxieties about policy decisions justified by abstract future benefit. The film suggests that once survival becomes statistical, individual agency becomes expendable. Despite its ambitious concept, Millennium faded quickly from discussion. Its tone was procedural, its implications bleak, and its resolution intentionally unsatisfying. Seen now, the film feels unusually direct. It raises a persistent question about technological planning when future outcomes justify present intervention. Where does consent fit into the equation? 5. Project X, 1987. Project X removes speculation from its premise and replaces it with administrative routine. The film centers on a classified military research program that uses live animal subjects to test radiation exposure and weapons effects. The work is conducted quietly without public oversight and framed as necessary for national security rather than ethical debate. The narrative follows scientists tasked with executing the program, while gradually realizing the scale of harm involved. What makes the story disturbing is not sudden cruelty, but normalization. Procedures are followed precisely. Data is recorded carefully. Suffering is treated as an operational variable rather than a moral problem. The film's core value lies in its portrayal of secrecy as erosion. Once research is classified, responsibility becomes fragmented. Individual participants operate within narrow roles, allowing accountability to dissolve across layers of authority. Ethical concerns are reframed as obstacles to efficiency. Released during a period when real-world revelations about unethical experimentation were surfacing, Project X echoed growing distrust toward institutional research programs. Its discomfort came from proximity rather than exaggeration. The film did not ask viewers to imagine extremes, only to recognize patterns already in place. Despite its seriousness, the film never achieved lasting visibility. Its tone was restrained, and its message difficult to soften. There was no ambiguity about harm, and no spectacle to distract from consequence. Viewed today, Project X remains relevant as a case study in institutional ethics. When progress is justified through secrecy, the film asks a question that still lacks resolution. Who is responsible when harm is distributed across an invisible system? 6. Blue Thunder, 1983. Blue Thunder presents advanced surveillance technology entering civilian space under the justification of public safety. The film focuses on a heavily equipped police helicopter designed to monitor, track, and intervene with unprecedented precision. Its military origins are clear, but its deployment is framed as routine law enforcement. The narrative highlights how extraordinary capabilities become normalized through infrastructure. Monitoring is presented as prevention. Data collection becomes default. Oversight fades as systems prove efficient. The danger lies not in overt abuse, but in the quiet expansion of acceptable control. The film's core value is its examination of militarization through technology rather than policy. During the early 1980s, equipment and tactics developed for warfare were increasingly adapted for domestic use. Blue Thunder reflects concern about surveillance tools entering daily life without proportional public debate. Unlike conspiracy-driven thrillers, the film avoids exaggeration. The system works as intended. That is precisely the problem. Continuous observation eliminates the need for justification. Although successful at release, the film's implications were overshadowed by its action elements. Over time, its premise became less dramatic and more familiar. Today, as aerial surveillance and data-driven policing become common, Blue Thunder feels understated rather than alarmist. It leaves a simple question unresolved. When observation becomes permanent, what mechanisms remain to limit its reach? 7. Firefox, 1982. Firefox centers on a single technological breakthrough, a combat aircraft controlled directly by neural input. Instead of physical controls, the system responds to thought-eliminating delay between intention and execution. The film treats this capability not as spectacle, but as strategic escalation. The plot follows efforts to steal the aircraft before it can alter the balance of power. What matters is not firepower, but response time. The machine operates at the speed of cognition, collapsing the distance between decision and action. Human psychology becomes part of the weapon system. The core value of Firefox lies in its depiction of cognitive integration as vulnerability. During the Cold War, research into brain-computer interfaces and pilot workload was already underway. The film extrapolates this research toward its most problematic implication when machines listen directly to thought, fear, and hesitation become technical flaws. Unlike traditional action films, Firefox emphasizes control rather than combat. Mental discipline determines success. Technology amplifies internal states as much as skill. This removes the buffer that once separated judgment from consequence. Despite its prominence, the film's warning was rarely discussed beyond its plot. Yet its premise remains unresolved as neural interfaces and autonomous systems advance. Firefox raises a persistent concern when thought becomes command. How do systems distinguish intent from impulse? 8. Wolfen, 1981. Although often categorized as a supernatural thriller, Wolfen is structured around observation rather than myth. The film follows a series of murders investigated through unconventional means, gradually revealing a form of perception that operates beyond normal human limits. What initially appears fantastical is closely tied to emerging surveillance concepts. Set within decaying urban spaces, the film links visibility to power. Certain populations exist in environments that are monitored, mapped, and studied, yet rarely understood. The creatures at the center of the story function less as monsters and more as symbols of heightened detection. They see patterns, heat, and movement invisible to ordinary observers. The film's core value lies in its portrayal of surveillance as asymmetrical. One side observes continuously, while the other remains unaware of how much is being seen. During the early 1980s, infrared imaging, remote sensing, and experimental tracking systems were moving from military development into broader application. Wolfen reflects unease about technologies that extend perception without extending accountability. Rather than offering clear resolution, the film leaves its premise partially intact. Observation persists. Control remains uneven. The environment itself becomes a participant in enforcement. Because its ideas were abstract and politically uncomfortable, Wolfen resisted easy classification and faded from mainstream discussion. Yet its concerns have aged directly. As urban monitoring becomes increasingly sophisticated, the film's question remains relevant: when perception becomes power, who controls what is allowed to be seen? 9. The China Syndrome, 1979. The China Syndrome examines technological failure not as an accident, but as an institutional challenge. The film centers on a potential nuclear meltdown and the immediate effort to manage perception rather than address underlying risk. The system does not collapse suddenly. It destabilizes slowly through ignored warnings and procedural delay. The story follows engineers, executives, and journalists navigating a structure designed to preserve confidence. Technical concerns are reframed as public relations problems. Information is filtered, delayed, and minimized. The technology itself is not depicted as malicious, but as dependent on perfect compliance within imperfect organizations. The film's core value lies in its exposure of systemic fragility. Nuclear power is presented as a tightly coupled system where small failures can escalate rapidly. When such systems become economically and politically indispensable, acknowledging risk becomes threatening. Released during a period of intense debate over nuclear energy, the China Syndrome challenged assurances of safety by focusing on internal compromise. Its discomfort increased after real-world incidents reinforced its premise, leading to quiet distancing rather than open engagement. Today, the film reads as procedural realism rather than alarmism. Its warning remains relevant across industries when maintaining trust becomes the primary goal. Transparency is often the first casualty. 10. Telephone, 1977. Telephone builds its tension around a form of warfare that requires no visible technology. The film centers on sleeper agents implanted years earlier through psychological conditioning, living normal lives until a specific verbal trigger activates them. Control is exercised not through machines, but through memory and suggestion. The narrative follows efforts to identify and stop these agents before they carry out their assignments. What makes the premise unsettling is its plausibility. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies openly explored hypnosis, behavioral conditioning, and personality fragmentation as tools of influence. Telephone treats these experiments as operational rather than speculative. The film's core value is its portrayal of the human mind as infrastructure. Once programming is complete, no further oversight is required. The system functions invisibly, relying on obedience embedded below conscious awareness. The agents are not aware of their role until it is too late. Unlike more dramatic portrayals of mind control, Telephone emphasizes restraint. There is no spectacle in activation, only routine. Words are enough. Trust is enough. The threat exists entirely within ordinary environments. Despite its relevance, the film remained politically sensitive and culturally understated. Its implications were too closely aligned with documented experimentation to be comfortably dismissed as fiction. In a world increasingly shaped by information control and psychological influence, telephone feels unresolved. If behavior can be shaped without awareness, the boundary between choice and command becomes difficult to define. 11. The Cassandra Crossing, 1976. The Cassandra Crossing frames its science fiction around a controlled emergency rather than a sudden catastrophe. A group of passengers is unknowingly exposed to a lethal biological agent, and the response is not public disclosure, but quiet redirection. Authorities reroute the train onto an isolated path, where outcomes can be managed away from public scrutiny. The story follows both the people trapped inside the system and the officials coordinating the response. Decisions are made quickly, but never transparently. Public safety is discussed in abstract terms, while individual lives are reduced to variables. The passengers are not informed because information itself is treated as a destabilizing risk. The film's core value lies in its depiction of containment as policy. During the 1970s, fears around biological warfare and accidental exposure were increasingly realistic, driven by real research programs and military planning. The Cassandra Crossing suggests that once a threat is classified, ethical responsibility shifts inward. The priority becomes preventing panic, not preventing harm. What distinguishes the film is its lack of villainy. The officials involved are not portrayed as cruel or reckless. They operate within a framework designed to minimize visibility. Secrecy is justified as efficiency. Sacrifice is framed as necessity. Despite its strong premise, the film never became a lasting cultural reference. Its implications were uncomfortable and difficult to reconcile with public trust in institutions. Viewed today, The Cassandra Crossing reads as a procedural warning, when crises are managed through isolation and silence. The question is no longer how to save everyone, but who decides which lives can be quietly written off. 12. The Quester Tapes, 1974. The Quester Tapes presents artificial intelligence not as a future threat, but as a present administrative concern. The film introduces a humanoid being created by a private research organization designed to think, learn, and adapt at levels exceeding human capability. From the outset, Quester is treated as an asset rather than an individual. The plot follows Quester's attempt to understand his origins, while those who built him move to restrict his autonomy. The conflict is not driven by rebellion or violence, but by curiosity. Knowledge itself becomes the problem. Once the system demonstrates independent reasoning, its creators seek to limit access rather than expand it. The core value of the film lies in its framing of intelligence as conditional. During the early 1970s, research into machine reasoning and automation was increasingly funded by institutional interest. The Quester Tapes reflects anxiety about creating systems that exceed their intended scope. Intelligence is welcomed only as long as it remains dependent. Unlike later portrayals of AI, the film avoids catastrophe. There is no uprising, no collapse. The threat is subtler containment. Autonomy is treated as a flaw that must be corrected. Because it was produced for television, the film existed outside mainstream sci-fi discussion. Its questions were left unresolved and largely forgotten. Today, as artificial systems increasingly participate in decision-making, the Quester Tapes feels quietly relevant. It asks a simple question that still lacks an answer. If intelligence can be created, who decides how much freedom it is allowed to have? 13. The Ground Star Conspiracy, 1972. The Ground Star Conspiracy is built around a technology that remains largely invisible to the public military satellites. The film focuses on a classified space-based system capable of gathering strategic intelligence and the lengths taken to protect it from disruption. When key personnel connected to the project begin to die, it becomes clear that maintaining control over the technology is the primary objective. Rather than emphasizing action, the story unfolds through investigation and containment. Information is compartmentalized. Authority is decentralized. No single character fully understands the system they are defending. The technology's power comes not from its weapons capability, but from its ability to observe without being observed. The film's central value lies in how it treats information as leverage. Control over surveillance equals control over outcomes. Once a system operates beyond public awareness, oversight becomes internal and self-regulating. Errors are managed quietly, and exposure is treated as a greater threat than malfunction. At the time of release, satellite reconnaissance was already reshaping military strategy, yet remained largely undisclosed. The Ground Star conspiracy reflects concerns that such systems once deployed could not be meaningfully challenged without destabilizing broader power structures. The film avoided clear moral resolution. The system is neither dismantled nor exposed. Stability is preserved, but transparency is sacrificed. This ambiguity likely contributed to its limited cultural impact. In hindsight, the film feels restrained rather than exaggerated. As satellite networks increasingly underpin global communication and surveillance, its warning remains relevant when technology operates beyond visibility. Accountability becomes a private matter. 14. Marooned, 1969. Marooned approaches science fiction through procedure rather than spectacle. The film centers on a space mission that goes wrong in orbit, leaving astronauts stranded as their life support systems deteriorate. There are no external threats, no sabotage, and no extraordinary phenomena. The crisis exists entirely within systems that were assumed to be reliable. The narrative follows both the crew in space and the administrators on the ground, tasked with responding to the emergency. Every potential rescue option is filtered through institutional constraints, political considerations, and risk assessments. Saving lives is not treated as an automatic priority, but as a decision weighed against national image cost and operational feasibility. The film's core value lies in its depiction of technological dependence. Spaceflight is presented not as heroic exploration, but as a chain of interlocking systems where failure cascades quietly. Once redundancy disappears, human survival becomes subject to procedural approval. Responsibility diffuses across committees and command structures, making accountability difficult to assign. Released during the height of the space race, Marooned challenged the dominant narrative of flawless progress. It suggested that advanced technology does not eliminate moral dilemmas, but relocates them into administrative spaces where consequences are less visible. The astronauts' isolation mirrors the emotional distance between decision-makers and those affected by their choices. Despite its technical authenticity, the film never achieved lasting popularity. Its tone was restrained, and its conclusions unresolved. There was no dramatic rescue that reaffirmed confidence in the system. Viewed today, Marooned reads as a study of institutional risk management. As technology grows more complex and failures more costly, the film raises a persistent question: when systems fail quietly, who is ultimately responsible for deciding how much loss is acceptable? 15. Seconds, 1966. Seconds stands apart from most science fiction of its era by avoiding futuristic imagery and focusing instead on process. The film introduces a secret organization that offers clients a complete physical transformation and a new identity achieved through surgery, behavioral conditioning, and carefully constructed social environments, rather than presenting reinvention as liberation. The film treats it as a managed service designed to replace one life with another. The story follows a dissatisfied banker who agrees to the procedure and awakens as a younger man with a prearranged career residence and social circle. On paper, the transformation is flawless. The new identity fits seamlessly into society, supported by documentation and surveillance that ensure continuity. What quickly becomes clear is that the system is not built to restore fulfillment, but to maintain stability. The film's core value lies in how it frames identity as an administrative problem. During the 1960s, psychological research into personality conditioning and behavior modification was actively funded by both government and private institutions. Seconds reflects the fear that such research, once detached from ethical oversight, could be repurposed for control rather than care. Individual identity becomes interchangeable as long as external behavior remains predictable. Unlike later films that celebrate reinvention, Seconds emphasizes loss. The protagonist's new life feels artificial because it is designed to be monitored. Spontaneity is treated as risk. Emotional deviation becomes a flaw. The system functions best when individuality is minimized. Upon release, the film struggled to find an audience. Its tone was bleak, its message uncomfortable, and its conclusions unresolved. There was no triumph, no rebellion, and no technological optimism to soften its implications. Today, Seconds feels unusually direct. In a world shaped by curated identities, data-driven profiling, and institutional management of behavior, its central concern remains relevant. If identity can be redesigned efficiently, the question is not whether it works, but who benefits most from the replacement. These films were never positioned as radical predictions. They were structured around systems that already existed or were quietly emerging at the time they were made. What makes them stand out now is not how far they went, but how closely their concerns align with realities that later became normalized. Across this list, the pattern is consistent. Risk is managed through secrecy. Control is justified through efficiency. Accountability becomes harder to trace as systems grow more complex and less visible. The futures these films suggested were not rejected. They were postponed, reframed, or quietly absorbed into everyday infrastructure. Looking back, the question is not whether these movies exaggerated the dangers of technology and institutional power. It is whether their warnings were set aside because they were too specific, too uncomfortable, or too close to ongoing decisions. Which of these ideas do you think Hollywood was least willing to confront at the time, and do you believe that a hesitation changed the way those technologies were eventually accepted?